If this story gave you chills, consider subscribing. Every follow helps keep these stories coming. See you in the next one. There are videos people watch again and again, not because they're good, but because they can't quite believe what their own eyes just showed them. It was raining that night. Not a heavy downpour, but the kind of persistent drizzle typical of the northern mountains in late spring. Tiny droplets drifting through the pale yellow glow of the LED lights lining the garden path. Duc sat in his small home office where he kept the security camera server for the homestay, a habit carried over from his years as a construction engineer, always wanting control over everything through technology. He was reviewing footage from the camera in the back garden, where the wildflowers Lin had planted over the past few months grew, just out of curiosity to see how the plants had developed over time, planning to cut it into a short time-lapse for the homestay's social media page. The computer screen cast a pale blue light across the dark room, reflecting off Duc's face, nothing but the sound of rain outside the window and the faint whir of the computer's cooling fan. He fast-forwarded through the footage, frames blurring past at high speed, day and night alternating in rapid flickers on the screen. Around 2:15 in the morning, Duc's finger, idly resting on the mouse, suddenly went still. He'd caught a small movement in the corner of the screen, just a flicker in a single frame before the video sped past it again. He quickly rewound, slowing the playback down to normal speed, eyes straining to catch every single frame. Right as the timestamp in the corner read 2:15:33, a small figure appeared in the middle of the garden, standing right among the wildflowers, exactly where the LED light barely reached the outer edge. Duc leaned in closer to the screen, his heart beginning to race a little faster, though even he wasn't sure why. The figure was small, barely 3 feet tall, standing perfectly still among the flowers swaying gently in the rain, showing no sign at all of being wet or moved by the wind like the flowers around it. He zoomed in as far as the resolution would allow. The camera's image quality, never particularly sharp, turned the figure blurry, just enough to make out the shape of a small child, short hair, standing with its back to the camera. Then, in exactly 2 seconds, the figure slowly turned around, as though sensing it was being watched from behind the lens, its face turning to face the camera directly. At that exact moment, the image on screen dissolved into violent static, horizontal and vertical lines tearing across the frame for a full second before returning to normal. The garden appeared empty once more, just the wildflowers swaying gently in the rain. Duc sat frozen in front of the screen, both hands still on the desk, but not moving at all. The sound of rain outside suddenly much louder in the abrupt stillness that had settled over the small room. He rewound the clip once more, then again. Cold sweat began beading at the back of his neck, though the room wasn't warm at all. He glanced at the clock on the wall, nearly 1 in the morning. Lin and little Sue were sleeping soundly in the next room, separated from him by nothing more than a thin wall. But in that moment, Duc felt as though he were sitting alone in some vast, distant space, utterly isolated. He wasn't sure what he'd just seen. It could have been a camera glitch, strange light refracting through the rain, his own imagination after too many sleepless weeks worrying over the construction project. But there was one thing he couldn't deny. His hand, reaching to close the video window, was trembling, completely beyond his control. This story, in truth, had begun more than a month before that night. A month before that rainy night, Lin stood in the middle of a small mountain valley, looking up at the rare, clear blue sky of a late winter morning, feeling as though she'd stepped straight out of the cover of a travel magazine. She was 27, had spent 5 years as a marketing employee at a media company in the city, A stable job with decent pay, but one that had never made her feel like she was truly living the life she wanted. The dream of running her own small homestay surrounded by nature had been growing in her heart for a long time. Every trip she took, every beautiful homestay photo she scrolled past on social media, stirred something restless inside her. Duc, her husband, stood beside her, notebook in hand, eyes scanning the entire plot of land, the engineer in him already sketching out the outlines of what could be built here. 30 years old, a construction engineer for a private firm for 8 years, Duc had always been the more practical one between the two of them. But even he had to admit, the view before them was almost impossibly beautiful. A small valley tucked between rolling mountain ranges, a stream winding gently through the middle, terraced rice fields stretching green up the distant slopes, and air so clean that every breath felt like it was filtering straight through the lungs. The woman showing them around was a middle-aged real estate agent named Tao, well known in the area. Slender build, neatly dressed, her soft voice carrying a quality that made people trust her almost from the first few words. This plot is nearly half an acre, faces right out over the valley, and has a stream running through it too. You couldn't ask for better if you're building a homestay, really. Miss Tao said, gesturing toward the small wooden stakes marking the property lines. Lin couldn't hide the excitement in her voice, her eyes lighting up as she pictured rows of small wooden cabins, hammocks swaying beneath the trees, the perfect photos she'd post online. "How much is the land going for?" Duc asked, keeping his usual professional caution in his tone. Miss Tao named a figure, and both of them couldn't hide their surprise. It was significantly lower than similar plots they'd looked at before, low enough that Duc had to ask again just to make sure he'd heard correctly. "The land's cheap here because it's a bit far from the center. The roads aren't great yet, and, well," Miss Tao hesitated for a moment, as though weighing whether to say something or not. "The previous owner wanted a quick sale, so it's priced a bit under market to make the deal go smoothly, that's all." That answer sounded perfectly reasonable, and in the excitement of finally being within reach of a long-held dream, neither Lin nor Duc thought to question it any further. While walking them through the property, Miss Tao passed by a small patch of land tucked in the northeast corner, slightly sunken compared to the rest of the plot, thick with overgrown weeds. Her footsteps suddenly slowed, nearly stopping entirely for a moment. Her eyes fixed on the weeds, a distant look crossing her face, as though gazing at somewhere far away, somewhere entirely different from the valley in front of her. Lin, busy taking scenery photos, happened to notice the fleeting change on the agent's face. "Miss Tao, what's that spot over there? Why's the grass so overgrown?" Miss Tao startled slightly, as though pulled back from some distant thought, turning to Lin with a quick smile, a little forced. "Probably just an old grave marker, sweetheart. Mountain land tends to have a few of those scattered around. Nothing to worry about." She said it and kept walking, her voice returning to its familiar enthusiasm as she went on describing the sun exposure and wind direction of the property. Lin nodded, not thinking any more of it, following along behind Miss Tao, completely unaware that behind her, the agent had glanced back at that patch of ground one more time, very quickly, very quietly, before continuing on.
That evening, in the small rented room they'd taken in the nearest town, Lin and Duc sat across from each other at an old wooden table, a folder of land documents between them, alongside a laptop open to a spreadsheet of investment costs. Duc scanned through the numbers, fingers tapping steadily on the calculator, his face tense in the way of a man weighing one of the biggest decisions of his life. With the capital we have, plus the bank loan, buying this land still leaves us enough to build according to the original plan. I think this is a good opportunity, Lin." Lin sat beside him, turning her cup of hot tea slowly in her hands, gazing out the window where the pale yellow streetlight fell across the quiet mountain town road. "I think so too. Standing there this morning, I really felt like this was the place I've been looking for all along." She turned to her husband, her eyes shining with hope. "You know, I could picture myself sitting on the porch in the morning, watching the mountain mist clear, listening to the stream, and then tourists arriving, and I'd welcome them, tell them about this place. I felt so happy just imagining it." Duc smiled at his wife, warmth spreading through his chest at seeing the joy so clearly written on Lin's face. A joy her tedious marketing job in the city had never once given her in all those years. "There's just one thing that's been bothering me a little," Duc said, his voice slowing. "What is it?" "That sunken patch of ground earlier. Miss Tao said it's an old grave marker, but something felt off to me. I don't know how to explain it exactly, but the way she looked at it, I got the feeling it wasn't just some ordinary grave marker." Lin thought it over for a moment, then waved it off with a light gesture. "You're probably overthinking it. It's mountain country. There are graves scattered all over the place. It doesn't matter. We'll just build well away from it. No need to worry so much." Duc nodded, telling himself his wife was probably right, that he was likely overanalyzing things given the pressure of such a major financial decision. He closed the folder, placing his hand on top of it, his voice firm now. "All right then, let's decide. We'll call Miss Tao tomorrow, get the paperwork started for the purchase." Lin nodded, a radiant smile spreading across her face, standing to embrace her husband, both of them laughing together in the small rented room, completely unaware that the decision they'd just made that night would open a door leading to sleepless nights ahead, to things no blueprint, no detailed financial plan could ever have prepared them for. Outside the window, a gentle breeze drifted through, carrying with it an unusual chill from the mountain forest, slipping through the gap in the door into the small room, causing the small candle on the table to flicker for a moment, then settle still again, as though nothing had happened at all. Construction broke ground on a morning in early March, when the mountain mist hadn't yet fully lifted off the surrounding hills. Duc stood in the middle of the cleared lot, holding the printed blueprint he'd carefully colored in, filled with an excitement he'd never quite felt in his 8 years of building for other people. This was his first project for himself, for his own family. He'd hired a local construction crew, rugged men accustomed to leveling ground, raising traditional stilt houses, but also skilled enough to work with modern reinforced concrete. A mini excavator had been rented from town, still fairly new, engine running smooth, its blade gleaming in the early morning light. Lin stood some distance away, phone raised, recording the entire moment, her voice bright with excitement for the video she planned to post to the Homestay's social media page that night. "Day 1, breaking ground on our dream homestay, everyone. Wish us luck." Duc signaled for the excavator operator to begin, leveling the entire lot section by section according to the marked stakes and orange plastic string laid out on the ground. Work proceeded smoothly for nearly an hour, the steady rumble of the engine blending with the morning bird song, with the wind rustling through the old trees still standing at the edge of the property. Near noon, the operator guided the machine toward the northeast corner of the lot, where a small patch of ground sat slightly lower than the rest, overgrown weeds nearly concealing an old wooden marker, badly rotted, its carved letters faded almost beyond recognition. No one on the crew had noticed it there. The excavator's blade lowered, preparing to bite into the first layer of soil, right at that spot. And the exact instant the steel blade touched the ground, a strange sound rang out. Not the ordinary crunch of soil being turned, but a dry, heavy thunk, as though something extremely hard was blocking it from below. The operator, by reflex, pressed the throttle harder to push through the obstacle. Immediately, the engine let out a piercing shriek, followed by the loud crack of metal snapping across the entire lot. The thick steel blade, designed to cut through even solid rock, bent at a bizarre angle, warping like a dry twig snapped in half. At the same moment, the engine died out completely, cutting off as though someone had pulled the plug, despite the fact that this was a diesel machine with no electrical cord to unplug at all. Thick black smoke suddenly poured from the exhaust pipe, but it wasn't the familiar smell of diesel fumes the crew had been breathing all morning. It was something else entirely. A rank, damp smell of stagnant mud, so overpowering that several workers standing nearby staggered back, hands clamped over their noses. The operator scrambled out of the cabin, face pale, staring at the twisted, broken blade lying on the ground. "I just checked this machine over yesterday. It's never done anything like this before." His voice trembled, not daring to look Duc in the eye. Duc stood frozen for a moment, eyes moving from the broken blade to the black smoke slowly dissipating into the air, finally settling on the rotted wooden marker now exposed beneath the overturned weeds. A cold chill crept down his spine, despite the blazing midday heat.
The whole crew stopped working, gathering around the broken excavator, murmuring anxiously in the local dialect that Linh and Duc couldn't fully understand. One of the older workers, his eyes carrying a wary look, murmured something to the man beside him, just loud enough for Duc to catch a few fragmented words. "Grave. Sacred. Don't touch." Right then, the sound of hurried footsteps came from the direction of the path leading into the village. An elderly man, his gait uneven but moving with surprising speed, leaning on a bamboo cane, hurried toward them, his voice breaking with urgency. "Stop! Stop right now! Don't touch that spot!" Duc turned to look at the unfamiliar old man, not yet understanding what was happening. The old man, who Linh and Duc would later learn was named Grandpa Sao, stood before them catching his breath, eyes fixed on the rotted wooden marker lying exposed on the disturbed earth, his voice trembling with a mix of urgency and grief. "This ground is sacred, children. This ground cannot be broken." Linh stepped closer, her voice uncertain. "Sir, is this someone's grave? We bought this land legally. We have all the proper paperwork." Grandpa Sao looked at her for a long moment, his expression complicated, as though wanting to explain everything and yet holding something back at the same time. "It's a long story, child. Let me tell you another time. For now, I only ask one thing of you. Please, don't touch that spirit grave again." Duc looked at the broken excavator, then at the blueprint in his hand, then finally at the pitiful, worried expression on the old man's face. Despite the doubt still lingering in his mind, he couldn't bring himself to refuse such a heartfelt plea. "All right, sir. I'll have the marker carefully moved somewhere else, and we won't disturb that spot again." Grandpa Sao nodded, letting out a relieved sigh, though his eyes never left the wooden marker, as though silently apologizing to someone for having let it be disturbed, even briefly. That afternoon, Duc had 2 workers gently lift the rotted marker and move it to a small corner of the garden, a spot he planned to fill with flowers later on. He didn't read closely the faded, nearly illegible lines carved into the wood. Had he read them carefully, he might have noticed 2 names etched there, worn thin by the passage of time. The excavator was sent for repair that same afternoon, and the repairman scratched his head,
unable to explain how a solid steel blade, never once put under heavy strain before, could bend so strangely from a single light contact with soft earth. The homestay gradually took shape after that, the small wooden cabins rising exactly according to Duc's design, the garden filled by Lin's own hands with wild, colorful flowers, creating a scene identical to the photos she'd always dreamed of. Little Sue, 5 years old, their daughter, quickly adjusted to the spacious, open air of the mountain, so different from the cramped city apartment she'd grown up in for the first years of her life. The child often played alone in the garden each afternoon, while her parents were buried in the countless nameless tasks that came with running a brand new homestay. Lin, sometimes standing in the kitchen looking out through the window, would see her daughter sitting on the grass, one hand waving through the air as though playing with someone, giggling to herself. At first, Lin simply assumed it was the rich imagination of a young child, entirely normal at that age. One late afternoon, as golden sunlight bathed the garden in warm, amber tones, Lin went out to call her daughter in for dinner and found Sue crouched down, holding something small, turning it over in the fading light. "What are you holding, Sue?" Sue looked up, her face beaming, holding the object up to show her mother. It was a small silver bracelet, simple in design, its surface tarnished dark, several spots corroded with age, sized perfectly for a toddler no older than 2 or 3. Lin crouched down, taking the bracelet from her daughter's hand, turning it in the light, feeling the cold metal against her fingertips despite the warm afternoon air. "Where did you get this, Sue? Where did such a strange bracelet come from in our garden?" Sue looked at her mother, her expression innocent, without a hint of suspicion, answering as naturally as if she were describing a classmate from preschool. "Sister Nu lent it to me to play with, Mom. She said I could keep it, and she'd take it back whenever she needs it." Lin froze, still holding the bracelet, staring at her daughter for a long moment. "Who's Sister Nu? A new friend from school?" Sue shook her head, pointing toward the corner of the garden, exactly where the rotted wooden marker now rested among the wildflowers. "No, Mom. Sister Nu is over there. She plays with me every afternoon, and her mommy's there too. Her mommy sings me songs sometimes." A light breeze drifted through the garden, gently stirring the wildflowers. Lin stood there, still gripping the cold silver bracelet, following the direction her daughter had pointed, a vague, unnameable feeling settling into her chest. "Don't make up stories, sweetheart. Let's go eat dinner," she said, trying to keep her voice normal, but her hand instinctively tightened around the bracelet, unwilling to set it down, unwilling to throw it away either. That night, after Sue had fallen asleep, Lin sat alone in the living room, placing the small silver bracelet on the table, studying it under the yellow lamplight. She intended to ask Duc whether they should check with anyone in the village, in case it belonged to some family who'd lost it. But the busy work of the day carried her away, and the bracelet was tucked temporarily into the drawer of the bedside table. And the story of Sue's Sister Nu gradually faded into the background of both parents' minds, just a small, whimsical memory of their daughter's imagination. The homestay's opening night fell on the late April evening, when all the wooden cabins stood complete, when Lin's wildflower garden bloomed at its most beautiful, and when the carved wooden sign bearing the homestay's name hung proudly at the entrance. They invited about 15 close friends from the city to celebrate, hosting a small outdoor party, string lights draped across the garden creating a dazzling, dreamlike atmosphere. Soft music played from a portable speaker set in the corner of the yard, laughter and chatter filling the air, glasses clinking together, all blending into what felt like the perfect evening. exactly what Lin had dreamed of for so many months. By nearly 11 at night, when the guests began to tire, some already retreating to their rooms, the rest gathered around a small bonfire. Lin quietly slipped away from the group, walking out to the main house's porch, wanting a private moment to savor what she'd built. She stood leaning against the wooden railing, gazing up at the rare, perfectly clear mountain sky, stars scattered thick as spilled powder across the black expanse. A crescent moon hanging distant, its pale silver light washing gently over the whole valley. The night air carried the faint, sweet scent of wildflowers, a familiar smell Lin had grown used to over the weeks since planting each cluster of flowers herself. Crickets chirped steadily from the surrounding grass, mingling with the soft trickling of the stream in the distance, creating a gentle harmony unique to the mountain night. Lin breathed deeply, feeling a peace settle over her entire body, her heart swelling with a happiness she'd never fully experienced in all her years trapped behind an office desk in the city. She thought back on the past month, the sleepless nights worrying over construction progress, the small arguments with Duc over financial pressure, and standing here now, seeing the result of it all before her, every hardship seemed worth it. Right as she sank deeper into that stream of thought, a strange smell suddenly cut through the air, shattering the gentle floral scent entirely. The smell of stagnant mud. Not the ordinary smell of damp earth after rain, but something thick, rank, evoking stagnant puddles left too long. Mud settled at the bottom of a pond, a smell entirely foreign to the dry, clean garden she'd tended so carefully for weeks. Lin frowned, turning to look around, trying to trace the source of the strange smell, but the garden appeared normal beneath the moonlight, nothing visibly out of place. Then, without any warning at all, every string light draped across the garden cut out at once. Not flickering the way lights do with weak power, but shutting off completely, plunging the entire garden into thick darkness for a single moment before flickering back on immediately after. But in that brief, pitch-black instant, less than a second long, Lin saw it. Right at the northeast corner of the garden, exactly where the rotted wooden marker had been relocated, among the wildflowers blooming beneath the moonlight, a figure appeared. The figure of a woman, slender build, long hair falling to her waist, standing straight, motionless, both arms cradling a small child pressed close to her chest. In that brief darkness, Lin couldn't make out the woman's face clearly, only sensing a distinct presence, a solid shape amid the darkness, different from the faint shadows moonlight usually cast across the shrubs. The garden lights flickered back on. The spot where the figure had stood was empty now, only the wildflowers swaying gently in the night breeze, exactly like any other ordinary night. Lin stood frozen, both hands gripping the wooden railing tight, her heart hammering wildly in her chest, breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She didn't dare blink, eyes still fixed on that spot, waiting to see what would happen next. But nothing more happened. The garden returned to its usual peaceful state, crickets still chirping, the stream still trickling, the music and laughter of her friends still drifting over from the bonfire, completely unaware of what had just occurred only a few dozen yards away. Lin stood there for a long while, trying to steady her breathing, telling herself she'd probably had too much wine at the party, that the moonlight and shadows from the trees had created some momentary visual trick, that the exhaustion of a month spent preparing for opening night had simply strained her nerves too far.
She tried to convince herself with these reasonable explanations, but when she stepped back inside, rejoining her friends by the bonfire, Her hands were still trembling slightly, and she couldn't quite shake the cold feeling that had settled deep into her chest from that moment. She didn't tell Duc or anyone else about what happened that night. Some part of her wanted to keep it to herself, not yet ready to face the possibility that she'd just seen something that couldn't be explained by ordinary reason.
The following days passed in the busy whirlwind of running a newly opened homestay, tourists beginning to book steadily thanks to the beautiful photos Lynn posted on social media, work sweeping both husband and wife into an entirely new rhythm of life, gradually pushing the memory of opening night into a corner of Lynn's mind. But at night, once the sounds of the day had settled, when only crickets and mountain wind remained, Lynn found herself struggling to sleep more and more. She lay tossing and turning for hours beside Duc, already sound asleep, ears straining for every small sound drifting in from outside the window, though she herself didn't quite know what she was waiting for. One night, around 2 a.m, drifting somewhere between waking and sleep, Lynn suddenly heard a faint, distant sound, so soft she couldn't be certain whether she'd truly heard it or whether it was simply part of a dream forming in her mind. It was the melody of a lullaby. The tune moved slow and rhythmic, rising and falling in an unfamiliar cadence. Not any of the Vietnamese lullabies Lynn sang to her own daughter each night, but something else entirely. Rounded syllables flowing in the particular rhythm of a mountain ethnic language. Lynn opened her eyes, lying still, listening, trying to determine where the sound was coming from. It seemed to drift in from the direction of the garden, from exactly the northeast corner where she'd seen the strange figure on opening night. She lay motionless for nearly 5 minutes, heart pounding, waiting for the sound to repeat, but it gradually faded, dissolving into the night wind, leaving a heavy silence settling over the room. The next morning, while preparing breakfast for her family, Lynn received a notification of a new review on the homestay's social media page. She opened her phone, scrolling through, at first just the familiar praise about the beautiful scenery, clean rooms, attentive service that she'd read dozens of times before from other guests. But at the very end of the review, her hand stopped scrolling. The guest had written, "Heard what sounded like a lullaby drifting through the garden last night. Figured it must be a neighbor's baby. Sounded sweet, but also kind of eerie. Not sure how it came through so clearly with the windows shut tight." Lynn stood frozen in the kitchen, the phone in her hand trembling slightly. She knew, without a doubt, there were no other houses within 1.5 miles of the homestay. This area was completely isolated, surrounded entirely by mountain forest, the only path leading to the village a considerable distance away. She set the phone down, both hands gripping the edge of the kitchen counter, trying to breathe steadily to calm herself. In her mind, the image of the woman cradling a child on opening night surfaced again clearly, combined now with the lullaby she'd heard the night before, and now confirmation from a complete stranger who had no idea what she herself had experienced. She could no longer convince herself it was just an illusion, just imagination from exhaustion. Something was truly happening in this place, something she needed to understand clearly, even as a vague dread rose within her about what she might discover.
A few days later, on a late afternoon when the sunlight had turned amber-orange, casting a warm glow across the garden, Lynn sat on the porch, notebook of bookings in hand, but her mind couldn't fully focus on the work in front of her. She kept glancing out at the garden, where Sue was playing alone as usual. The child sat cross-legged on the grass near the wildflower bed, one hand waving through the air in that familiar gesture Lynn had seen many times before, giggling to herself, occasionally chattering in the innocent, sing-song voice of a young child. Lynn set her notebook down, standing and walking closer to her daughter, a curiosity mixed with worry pulling her toward observing more closely what the child was doing. As she got closer, she saw Sue holding something small, faint metallic glimmers catching weakly in the afternoon light. "What are you holding, Sue?" Sue looked up at her mother, face beaming, holding the object up to show off. It was the small silver bracelet, the very same one Lynn had found in her daughter's hand weeks earlier, the one she'd tucked away in the bedside table drawer and nearly forgotten amid the whirlwind of daily work. A cold chill ran down Lynn's spine. "Where did you get that bracelet from?" "Mom put that away in the drawer in my room, remember?" Sue looked at her mother, confused as to why she was asking, her tone as natural as though describing the most obvious thing in the world. "Sister New got it back for me to play with, Mom. She said you put it away too well, said it was hard for her to get it out." Lynn stood frozen, staring down at the silver bracelet in her daughter's hand, then up at Sue's innocent face, a chilling sensation spreading through her entire body. She remembered clearly. That drawer was always kept shut, placed fairly high on the bedside table, well out of reach for a 5-year-old. Did you go into Mommy's room to get the bracelet?" Lynn asked, trying to keep her voice as calm as possible. Sue shook her head, still wearing that same innocent, untroubled expression. "No, Mom. I was playing here, and Sister New just gave it to me. She said she likes me a lot. She wants to play with me all the time." Lynn crouched down, gently taking her daughter's hand, her eyes never leaving the silver bracelet resting in her small palm. "What does Sister New look like, sweetheart? Can you describe her for Mommy?" Sue thought for a moment, her round eyes looking up at the sky as though trying to remember, then answered, "Sister New's a little smaller than me. She wears an old brown shirt. Her hair's short. She's always with her mommy. Her mommy's really pretty. She has long hair, and she holds Sister New and sings to her." Every detail Sue spoke made Lynn's heart race faster, each small piece slowly forming into a picture she wasn't yet ready to face in full. She thought of the figure cradling a child she'd seen on opening night, thought of the strange lullaby, and now, chilling detailed descriptions from her own daughter, a child who had no idea about any of her mother's experiences at all.
That night, after telling Duc the entire story over dinner, the two of them sat in the living room for a long while, neither speaking, only the steady ticking of the wall clock breaking the heavy silence. Duc, despite being the more rational, practical one of the two, couldn't find any reasonable explanation for what Lynn had described, especially the detail of the silver bracelet reappearing in their daughter's hand, despite being carefully locked away. Should we talk to that old man again? Grandpa Sao, the one who stopped the excavator that day? Lynn asked, her voice soft, unease still lingering in her eyes. Duc nodded, rubbing his temples, his face weary from thinking too much. "Yeah, I'll go find him tomorrow and ask around. He might know something about this land that we haven't heard yet." That night, Duc tossed and turned, unable to sleep, his mind spinning with a barrage of unanswered questions. He lay beside Lynn, already asleep from exhaustion, eyes fixed on the dark ceiling, ears alert to every small sound of the late night. Close to 3 in the morning, he heard a faint sound coming from the room next door, Sue's bedroom. At first, he thought his daughter was simply turning over in her sleep, but the sound continued, steady, like small footsteps moving softly. Duc sat up, stepping quietly out of bed so as not to wake Lynn, heading to check on his daughter. When he opened the door, his heart seemed to stop for a moment.
Sue's small bed was empty, the blanket and pillow tossed to one side. No sign of his daughter anywhere. He rushed out of the room in a panic, running down the hallway, calling his daughter's name in a hushed, urgent whisper, not daring to shout loudly for fear of disturbing the other guests staying at the homestay. He ran to the front door leading to the garden, and through the glass panel, beneath the pale moonlight, he saw his daughter. Sue was standing in the middle of the garden, right at the northeast corner, exactly where the rotted wooden marker still rested quietly among the wildflowers. Duc pushed the door open and rushed outside, his bare feet hitting the cold, late-night earth, heart pounding violently in his chest. As he got closer, he stopped, standing a few steps away from his daughter, not daring to move any closer, not daring to breathe too loudly. Sue stood there, one arm raised high in the air, small fingers curled as though gripping an invisible hand, her face tilted upward, eyes shining brightly beneath the moonlight, lips curved in a giggling smile, showing no fear at all. Night dew had already gathered in tiny droplets across her hair, across the thin fabric of the shirt she wore, proof that she'd been standing there not just for a moment, but for quite some time already. Duc stood frozen, watching his daughter play with something he couldn't see at all. The chill he felt not just from the night air, but from a deep, primal fear creeping into his very bones. "Sue, sweetheart, what are you doing out here?" He called out, his voice trembling as he tried to keep it as normal as possible so as not to frighten his daughter. Sue turned to look at her father, her face still bright with innocent joy. "I'm playing with Sister Nu, Daddy. She said she's really happy to have a friend to play with." Duc stepped closer, gently lifting his daughter off the cold ground, and the exact moment he lifted her up, a sudden, freezing gust of wind swept past right beside him, strong enough to sway the wildflowers around them, despite there having been no wind strong enough for that just moments before. The sensation, as though someone had just let go of Sue's small hand, reluctantly releasing the child back into the worried embrace of her father. Duc held his daughter tight, hurrying back inside, not daring to look back over his shoulder, his heart still pounding hard for a long while, even after he'd locked the front door tightly, more carefully than he'd ever locked it in the entire month since they'd moved here. The next morning, after a night with barely any sleep at all, Duc decided he couldn't wait any longer. He asked around the village, finding his way to Grandpa Sao's house, the old man who had stopped the excavator on the day of the groundbreaking. Grandpa Sao's home was a small stilt house nestled beneath a large old tree, its tiled roof coated with green moss from years of weather, thin smoke rising from the chimney behind the house, signaling the old man preparing his morning meal. Grandpa Sao sat on his porch, slowly weaving thin strips of bamboo, and when he saw Duc approaching, he looked up, his expression showing no surprise at all, as though he'd known this day would come. "You've come then," he said, his voice low, not a question, but a statement of fact. Duc sat down on the wooden step across from the old man, hands clasped together resting on his knees, his mind full of questions built up over the past several days, unsure where to even begin. "Sir, I wanted to ask you about that patch of land, the one with the wooden marker. I think something's happening at our homestay that I can't understand." Grandpa Sao stopped weaving, setting the bamboo aside, letting out a long, deep sigh, his eyes gazing off toward the mist-covered mountains in the distance. "That story, I've kept it buried in my heart for 30 years now. I thought, if we just left that land alone, no one touching it,
then everything would stay peaceful too. But now, he paused, looking directly into Duc's eyes, his gaze heavy with the weight of a man about to reopen a wound he'd tried so hard to keep closed for so long. Now I suppose it's time to tell it. He poured himself a cup of hot tea from a clay pot beside him, took a small sip, as though bracing himself for what he was about to say. 30 years ago, right where you bought that land, there was a small family living there. The mother's name was Men. Gentle soul, the whole village adored her. Her husband died young from illness, so she raised her little daughter alone. Name was Nu, only 3 years old at the time. Duc sat in silence, listening intently to every word, a cold chill creeping down his spine at hearing the name Nu. The exact name Sue had been mentioning for weeks now. Grandpa Sao continued, his voice slow, filled with nostalgia. Men used to carry her daughter down to the stream to bathe every afternoon. The sound of that little girl's laughter would carry across half the village. Everyone loved those two dearly, seeing how hard she worked, raising her child alone, never once complaining. At this point, Grandpa Sao paused, his aged face suddenly sagging, his eyes already welling with tears, and he raised a hand slowly to wipe at the corners of his eyes, his voice catching. But what happened after that? Let me tell you another time, all right? I need a little more time. Duc looked at the old man, struggling to hold back his emotions, understanding this wasn't the moment to press further, despite the burning desire in his own heart to know the full story. He nodded, stood up, thanked the old man, and promised to return another day. On the walk back to the homestay, Duc's mind weighed heavy with what he'd just heard, along with a growing, uneasy premonition. This story was far from over, and the worst was likely still waiting ahead. In the days following the unfinished conversation with Grandpa Sao, the atmosphere at the homestay grew heavier by the night, even as everything outwardly continued to run smoothly. Tourists kept coming, beautiful photos kept getting posted, glowing reviews kept appearing online. But inside, both Linh and Duc felt a quiet tension building steadily with each passing night. The lullaby in that unfamiliar mountain language now appeared regularly, no longer a one-time occurrence, but a fixed part of every night now, rising consistently between 1 and 3 in the morning, its slow, mournful melody carrying a deep sorrow neither of them could quite name. What struck them most was that little Sue, in stark contrast to her parents' growing exhaustion and worry, slept more peacefully than ever since moving here. The child no longer woke crying in the middle of the night the way she used to back in the city, her face always calm while sleeping, sometimes even breaking into a soft smile in her dreams, as though someone were gently watching over her, keeping her safe. That contrast only deepened Lin's unease. She lay awake beside Duc each night, listening to the lullaby drifting in from the garden, her eyes drifting to the small crib where her daughter slept soundly, feeling both relieved that Sue had no nightmares and gripped by a vague, unnameable dread all at once. One night, around 2 in the morning, Duc woke to the sound of Linh stirring beside him. He opened his eyes to find his wife sitting bolt upright in bed, arms wrapped tight around her knees, her whole body trembling. "What's wrong, Linh?" Linh turned to look at her husband, her face pale in the dim light seeping through the window, her voice shaking. "I just dreamed. I saw her, Duc. Men." Duc sat up fully, facing his wife, taking her trembling hands in his. "What did you see? Tell me." Linh took a deep breath, trying to steady herself enough to recount the dream, her voice halting, pausing often as she struggled to remember every detail. I was standing in the middle of a huge current of water, rushing so fast, everything around me was pitch black, just the sound of water roaring like thunder. Then I saw a woman, long hair, trying to swim against the current, one arm holding her small child tight against her chest, the other reaching desperately for a branch drifting past. She kept calling out a name, calling and calling, her voice growing weaker with each wave that crashed over her. I couldn't make out the name clearly, but the pain, the desperation in that voice, I'll never forget it. Duck sat still, gripping his wife's hand tightly, sensing the lingering horror still visible in Lin's eyes. What happened next? Then the water swept her away, both of them, disappearing into the black current. Right before she vanished completely, she turned and looked straight at me. And that look, Duck, it wasn't anger, it wasn't blame, it was just pleading for something, and I don't understand what. Lin broke down, burying her face in her husband's shoulder, tears soaking into his shirt, her whole body still trembling with the lingering weight of the achingly vivid, sorrowful dream she'd just experienced. Duck held his wife close, gently rubbing her back to soothe her, but inside, an unease of his own was rising steadily. The scattered pieces were beginning to fit together. Grandpa Sao's unfinished story, the name Nu matching exactly what Sue had been saying, and now, the vivid image of a mother drowning in raging floodwater appearing clearly in Lin's dream.
The next morning, while Lin was still recovering from the previous night's dream, another event occurred, this time in broad daylight, witnessed by more people than ever before. A group of tourists staying at the homestay, 4 young friends, sat eating breakfast out in the garden, enjoying the fresh morning air. One of them, a young woman named Ha, held her phone up recording a video for her personal social media, the camera panning across the beautiful garden, past the rows of wooden cabins, past the smiling faces of her friends. When the camera swept past the northeast corner of the garden, where the wooden marker still rested quietly among the flowers, Ha suddenly paused, frowning at her phone screen. "Huh, what is that?" she murmured, zooming the camera in closer to get a better look. On the phone screen, right at that spot, appeared a strange, blurred smudge, unlike any natural light effect, its faint shape suggesting a figure bent low, reaching toward the flowers. The others crowded around to look, all of them surprised, murmuring among themselves. Probably just a camera glitch, or maybe the sunlight's reflecting off something. One of the group offered, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation, though even his own tone lacked full confidence. Lin, standing nearby preparing breakfast for the guests, happened to overhear the conversation, walking over, her heart racing when she saw the image on Ha's phone screen. "Can I see that for a second?" Ha handed over her phone, and Lin stared intently at the video clip, hands trembling slightly as she zoomed in as far as possible. The blurred smudge, though indistinct, its shape unmistakably reminded Lin of the figure she'd seen on opening night. The same crouched posture, the exact same location where the wooden marker had been placed. She stood frozen for a long moment, then handed the phone back to Ha, forcing herself to keep her voice normal. "It's probably just a camera glitch, sweetie. I've heard other homestays get that a lot from the high humidity in the air." She offered that explanation, but deep down, she didn't believe a word of what she'd just said herself. Inside, Lin felt a truth taking clearer shape than ever before. This was no longer something only she had witnessed, no longer a personal hallucination born of exhaustion or stress. Multiple people, at different times, were all witnessing the same thing.
That afternoon, Lin called Duc, who was out in town running errands, her voice full of unmistakable worry. "We need to go see Grandpa Sao again right away. We can't wait any longer. I feel like things are getting more serious by the day."
While waiting for another chance to speak with Grandpa Sao, Lin, drawing on her instincts from her years in marketing, accustomed to hunting down information, decided to search online herself for the history of this land. She spent hours in front of the computer, typing every keyword related to the area, to natural disasters that might have occurred in this mountain region in the past, hoping to find some clue that could either confirm or dispel what she feared. After hours of fruitless searching, she finally found a link to the provincial digital archive, storing old newspaper articles digitized from decades past. She filtered by date, by geographic area, and finally, one article appeared on screen. A scanned image from a yellowed old newspaper, its bold headline reading, "Devastating flash flood sweeps away homes, 2 missing, bodies never recovered." Lin's hand trembled as she scrolled down to read the content, each line appearing before her eyes like a knife cutting into her heart. The article described the terrible flash flood that struck exactly on the 15th night of the 7th lunar month, 30 years ago, sweeping away part of a mountain village, including the small home of a woman named Men, 26 years old, and her 3-year-old daughter, Nu. The bodies of the mother and daughter were never found, the raging floodwater carrying them away entirely. Only a few scattered pieces of household debris later recovered several miles downstream. Lin read the passage over and over, tears beginning to fall uncontrollably, not just from the chilling parallel to everything she'd experienced, but from the genuine grief of a true story, a real human life stolen away so unjustly. She scrolled further down beneath the article, to a short interview with a relative of the victims, just a few sentences long, but enough to make Lin jolt up from her chair in absolute shock. The interview quoted a young girl, 15 years old at the time, identified as the sole surviving sister of the victim, her name printed clearly in the article. Tao. Lin stared at that name on the screen, her heart seeming to stop for a moment. That was the exact name of the real estate agent who had sold them this land. The woman who had stood so strangely still before that overgrown, sunken patch of earth on the day she'd shown them the property. Who had told her it was probably just some old grave marker. Miss Tao was Men's own sister. The woman who had sold them the very land where her own family's tragedy lay buried, without ever once speaking a word of the truth to them. Lin sat there, still gripping the edge of her laptop screen, her mind spinning with 100 questions arriving all at once. Why had Miss Tao hidden this? Why would she sell the exact plot of land holding her family's most painful memory to a completely unfamiliar family without offering the slightest warning of any kind? And more importantly, what else was she still hiding? Something perhaps even heavier, more painful than what Lin had just read in this old, faded article. Part 1 ends here. Lin has just found an old newspaper article. The name of the agent who sold her the land, Tao, appears in it as the only surviving relative of the 2 victims. Miss Tao is Men's own sister. The woman who sold Lin the exact land where her own family's tragedy lies buried, without ever saying a word. Subscribe so you're here for it.